You're It. I'm Amanda Malcolm, and you're listening to You're It Girl, a podcast focused on you and what propels you. Because that past, it does not define you. Your time is now, and you're it, girl. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You're It, Girl. Today, we are talking about dun dun dun. The big D.
Not the fun one.
Not the fun one. Divorce. The not so fun one.
Not the fun one.
And I have to, fair warning, I've had a lot of coffee. Like, I don't know why I actually drink so much coffee. I was just telling Claire, who's my guest today, that you've seen on the podcast before, that I don't know why I just don't order decaf. You know? Like, I'm literally like shaking
also
in my seat right now.
D.
So, no, not the fun D.
No decaf, no divorce.
So I'm going to try my best. Like my voice, I feel like, is I'm going to be talking very quickly, and like my veins, I can feel it in my veins, you know? So I don't mean to be like overexcited. I'm a little jittery right now.
Amanda.
I'm like jumping out of my seat talking about divorce. So Claire, you've been on before, but introduce yourself just one more time. Give everybody a little bit of a rundown synopsis of you.
I am a great friend of Amanda's. We met about, almost 7 years ago. Literally seven and a half years ago. We've lived together for a period of time. I've worked for Amanda. I am working with Amanda. We'll give you a little clue about that next episode. Our daughters are the same age.
They're besties.
And Amanda and I went through a divorce around within a year or two of each other. And I wouldn't say that our divorces are exactly the same, but one of the things that I found solace with in my friendship with Amanda is that we have similar personality types, similar ways that we experience the world, similar things that we want to work through and change patterns with. And so for me to have Amanda while I was going through my divorce, and also I feel like I was a little bit helpful with Amanda as she navigated that, was just such a profound connective experience during one of the worst, most difficult times in my life. I do other things, but I think that's the proper prep for this podcast.
Yes, and you were right about that. So Claire, you got divorced about a year before I did. And I remember us having these long conversations at my house when you were going through divorce. And it's, whenever I think about that time period, I was married for 7 years with the same person for 13 years. But when I think back to that time period, even though our divorce was, I say, quote unquote, amicable, because John and I had a good relationship. There wasn't a lot of fighting. There wasn't a lot of arguing. But going through the divorce, you and I have talked about this before. It's almost like you're going through like a death, right? And so I remember at one point I had moved out and I was talking to you about, how I felt. And you had said, Amanda, at some point, you're just one of these days, you are just going to be taking a shower or sitting in the bath and you're just going to have a complete meltdown and just start crying. And that is exactly what happened. I was good for like a couple months, like I was in control of it. And then that happened. It was like 3 days where I just couldn't stop because of mourning this life that in my head that I had created of what I thought it was going to be. And now knowing that it had ended and it was almost like you were burying it. And then I had to like come out at the other side and create this new life. So this is what we wanted to talk about today, just who we were when we got married, how the divorce came about, what was the catalyst? 'Cause everybody always asks you that, right? Like, oh, why is it that you got divorced? Like, what was the catalyst? And it's always so many things. How we navigated through that, and then how we are where we are today. So I'll kind of flip that question back to you. Who were you when you got married? Who was this girl?
Oh my God.
A girl, because we were girls.
Such a girl. I love her so much. I would say really creative, really good heart, and just wildly codependent. I didn't really even understand what that was. Zero boundaries. And I really also kind of got suckered into this Disney fairy tale of relationships.
I love the Disney fairy tale.
I mean, I met it's really enough to make me want to ban Disney in my house, but that's it. We'll just listen. So I met my former husband. I was out with friends, and it was an insufferable conversation. So we were at this beer bar, and I kept going I was a beer aficionado at the time, and I ended up talking to this like really handsome guy at the bar, and we flirted, and I ended up ditching my friends to hang out with him. And we hung out all night. I went back to I went on vacation for 2 weeks. I talked to him every day, and I was like, I think I'm going to marry this guy. And when we first started dating, he was like just such he was just a Prince Charming. He wouldn't let me take the bus home from work. He was like, my girlfriend doesn't take the bus home from work. I was living in LA. I didn't like having a car. I liked biking everywhere, but it would be raining. He'd be like, no, I'm going to pick you up. He took me to Santa Barbara to this beautiful Airbnb, like just so treated me like I had not been treated before. I grew up in a very liberal, like politically liberal community, very women's rights, very, no, I'm going to pay for half of this date. I didn't have quite the understanding of that as I do now. And so meeting this guy who seemed sort of thoughtful and nurturing and really interested in creating experiences for me, I was in heaven. I was absolutely in heaven. And he was going through a really great period. So he had all of this energy and he wasn't nervous. But the other things that I didn't really understand at that time was, how to decide what my values are in partnership, how to discern the difference between somebody being really kind to me and somebody being reliable in a way that I feel trustworthy. And I really approached that relationship from my own patterns, which is to be really happy all of the time.
All the time.
To not have needs.
All the time.
To be a super caretaker. And that was great for a little bit. And then it started to really not work because in that caretaking, I self-abandoned a lot. I actually didn't even know what I was doing at the time. And then we had a baby, and that really put pressure on these pieces that I think I just blindly followed. I had this idea of a relationship. Oh, it's hard work. Oh, everybody sacrifices. Oh, marriages, everybody puts in 100% and that equals 50-50. Nobody's perfect. Don't ask for too much. And I had so much of that sort of cultural language, the way I had been raised, what I had seen, what the world was telling me, that I was a girl. I was really wildly unprepared to figure it out. So, who are you when you got married? You were also a girl.
I was a girl. Yes, I was a girl. And I think a lot of people, if you've listened to past episodes of mine, I go a little bit deeper into the story. So I'll just touch on some surface points. But I was, on the outside, I think people thought that I very much had things together. I always kind of create that persona. People always think that. But the truth of the matter is my family was in a terrible place at the time when I met my ex-husband. And, I worked for him. He was my boss. It was very scandalous. He was married. I was very young. He was 18 years older, or is 18 years older than I am. And he kind of rescued me. And I was insanely codependent just because of my past. And he swept me off my feet. I mean, I was a girl. I was dating, I dated boys, or men that thought or boys that thought they were men, but they were boys. And no one, similar to you, no one had taken care of me in that way. He was so kind to me. And he was this Prince Charming with the flowers and the gifts and the phone calls and the love bombing very early on and the I love yous very early on. And I thought that that was what love was supposed to look like and feel like. And, one of the red flags really should have been that our relationship didn't necessarily start on the best note, right? I mean, he cheated on his wife with me. And prior to that, I didn't really think that I had any play in that. Like, I didn't play any part in that because I wasn't the married one. But now having been married, like, that's really fucked up. And I was okay with it, but I thought he just wasn't happy. He chose me. This was fairy tale romance. This is what it was supposed to be. We fell in love. And for the most part, he made me feel very, very good. He also was, in charge of my finances. I worked for him. So, I mean, there's a lot of codependency issues for both of us. And he helped my family a lot. And my mom was not in a good place. I mean, she served time in Tent City when we were together, and he helped with a lot of things financially with my family too. And so it created this false sense of security and safety because of that. And at the time, I didn't really have any emotional needs.
Do you have emotions, Amanda?
I didn't have I literally didn't have emotions
How
either.
can you have
I didn't have
emotional
emotions.
needs?
I couldn't cry. Now I can, but I didn't have emotions at all. And I couldn't even cry. So how could I have had emotional needs? And I didn't know how to communicate anything other than happiness for what I felt that he was providing to me. And I mean, even leading up to our whole marriage, I mean, it was volatile. He proposed to me, and then the day after, he freaked out, panicked, then said he didn't want to marry me. There was a lot of pressure because of the time period that we had been together. So it wasn't this like speedy, like head over heels, like fall in love, like your story.
Mm-hmm.
This was very prolonged. It was prolonged because he was married and he needed to get a divorce and he needed to go through that. And he was petrified to get married again to another woman that would take everything from him.
Mm-hmm.
He was very, very, very scared. And because I am a people pleaser and I had complete self-worth issues, I had to make it my ultimate goal to make him understand that I wouldn't do that to him. And so you can see how... Oh, I know it's cringy. I mean, it really is cringy.
I feel for Amanda.
It's really, but you can see how this whole thing transpired, right? And the love that we shared still is, in my mind, it still was a form of love for the both of us. And we grew a certain way in our relationship, but we actually grew more once we divorced because we were together for so long and we were kind of went through this like tumultuous stuff. There is a weird level of understanding between the two of us that really, I think, because of the codependence, the positive piece of it was that we did both truly want for the other person to heal. And I think we just realized that together that wasn't going to be possible, even though I pulled the plug on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not something that he wanted. At the end of it now, when we look at it, we were both able to actually be able to heal and continue to do so. This is a continuous process, right? But continue to be able to do so separately. And now when we talk about those things and what brought us together and how the relationship ended, there is an understanding of why we were attracted to each other, what this trauma bond was, what this experience was, how it like continued to snowball into this like really big thing, and then how it ended and why it had to end the way that it did. So I wasn't in as healthy of a place, even though I think people thought that I was. When I met him, it was probably I was a teenager, but the most unhealthy someone could possibly be because I didn't have emotions or feelings and was dealing with this like tumultuous stuff
Yeah.
with my family where everyone else was more important than I. And I truly did need rescuing. And that is what he provided, even though it was kind of a false sense of safety and security, because for the two of us, there wasn't a lot of emotional bond because neither of us were capable of that with as old as he was. He was an addict in recovery. And so we couldn't, it was never going to be something that could have been forever. So
Yeah.
that's who I was,
Yeah.
which is weird
Yeah,
to think
and
about
you-
now.
I know. And you touched on this a little bit. But what was it like for you when you made that decision? I remember when you decided that I have to get a divorce. I have to do it. I think you talked about it. I mean, those decisions are big, and it took a while for you to get up the nerve to do it, and then also to make those first shifts. So who was that Amanda who was like, you know what, enough?
It took a long while. And honestly, what actually really helped was, this sounds really weird to say out loud, but I didn't think that it would be possible for me to do it without getting a lot of backlash and feeling a lot of shame and disappointment from others. That is why I actually held on, I think, a little bit longer. But it was actually seeing those navigate it before me, like yourself and my business partner, actually, where I thought, well, if they can do this and they are okay, and to see them navigate through it and become a better version of themselves and stronger at the end of it, it sounds bad, but I was like, okay, I can do it. I can have the strength. I have the strength to do that if these women have done it. But it was not an easy conversation. I mean,
I want to meet the person who has an easy let's get divorced conversation.
it was terrible, right? I mean, it's just the worst thing to sit across from the person that you once loved and have had deep feelings for, to now tell them you don't want to be with them anymore. What about you?
So much is coming up. I truly believe, not in any romantic way, I think we're over that, but I really believe that I was in love. I believe that my ex-husband loved me a lot. I believe he still loves me and is so appreciative of me as a mother. And I am really appreciative of everything he does for our daughter. And when our divorce was initiated, I was, I think, just really not a good person. I was not in a good place. And I'm not saying I was a bad person, but I was angry at him all the time. My experience of being married to somebody where there's a financial disparity and where I am dependent on them, like the stay-at-home mom gig for me was horrifying. I felt like a janitor. I felt like I had all of these jobs that I was never really good at, that I didn't feel like I was on a team. I felt very much abandoned to take care of my baby and then to be responsible for the fact that the house wasn't clean or that dinner wasn't on time or things weren't presented in a certain way. My job was my least favorite things to do. I have housekeepers now. Like I
love my housekeeper.
I love, but I was stuck in this loop of feeling so lonely, feeling like I was never quote unquote performing well enough, and also feeling really, even though we had money, I felt really financially trapped. I felt like I couldn't get on the same page with my former husband. And so we would get into these weird fights of, why was Target $200 for groceries and diapers? Because he didn't go to Target. He didn't know what these things spent. So he would get upset about the cost of these things. And then it would be like, well, why is golfing $600 for the weekend? Because that's what golfing costs. And so it was we would hit these things. And I felt, even though we had money, I always felt like I had to ask permission. And even though we had a rule of like, hey, $50 or less, we don't have to talk about it, I didn't have an idea of our financial landscape. And I felt incredibly trapped and terrified because I didn't feel like I could go anywhere. I hadn't worked since my daughter was born. And I didn't feel like we had good communication around finances. And my ex-husband's an entrepreneur. So especially when he's starting out, his business was a little bit like this. And he would come home really worried about work. And I would say, okay, what do we need to do? We can make changes. And then he would be insulted that I thought that he wasn't able to be a good provider. And it was so dramatic that I started to numb out. I was a big fan of mom wine, which I know so many mothers who actually are like fully sober right now, and that pulled them into, but I didn't know any other way to cope other than like having a glass of wine at 3 and at 7 and at 10 and just shutting down. I was bitter. I was resentful. I was always pointing out the ways that he didn't help me. It was very difficult for me to feel appreciative of the ways he did show up for our family, because I felt so abandoned to my core in these other ways where I felt like I was cleaning the house by myself, organizing everything for the child, waking up at 5 a.m., expected to feel sexual and sexy at like 11 p.m. when he felt like doing it. The burden was so great that the only feeling I ever felt was like sad, alone, and really mad because I felt abandoned by my partner. And that's not to say that he is a bad or a good person. I think it's just, at least for me, when I had that baby, I realized that I was in a position to no longer be independent and not have feelings. I really needed help. And I didn't feel like I was getting it. We had like a nanny come a couple hours a week, maybe 5 or 10. So that was like, ooh, like for 5 hours out of however many hours there are on a week, I get some time off. I was so exhausted, just really depleted. And so I was not a nice person. And I was particularly not nice. That's a very long way to say, I'm not surprised I got a divorce. I was mean all the time, but it was to my benefit for sure to kind of get kicked out of the nest.
Yeah. Hearing you talk about some of that stuff really brings up a lot of things for me too. One is the financial piece. It was different for me because I was not a stay-at-home mom, because there was a lot of pressure for me not to be that, because that is what his ex-wife was. He was very adamant about if he were to get married again, which obviously we did, that his new wife would not be in that role, that it didn't work. And so there was so much pressure for me to have to be perfect all the time. And I had a perfectionism like complex anyway, just because of feeling like being that way took a lot of attention away from like what was actually going on in my household. So I was actually really good at doing that, right? I could perform well in that role. So it was like, if I had to be that way, then I already knew how to do it. And I would be successful in this role as like wife, sexy wife, like professional and mom. And it was actually really like excruciating. And I don't remember a lot of it. I felt like, I think there was something because he had cheated, and I knew more about his background then, that I was always afraid that would happen. And so unless listen, like when I get up in the morning, like I get ready every day anyway, but being a new mom, it was really difficult, not having slept and to get up and like do my hair and my makeup and like be dressed impeccably and then have to work and then not be sleeping, because after my daughter went to take a nap, like it was either like I eat or I shower or I do work, and work always won. And then I also had to make sure that the house was clean, even though we had a cleaner. Like he was kind of a little bit OCD. And so there were all these things that I had to do, and it was exhausting. And the financial piece is interesting that you brought that up, because, I worked, but until I went into real estate, I worked for him. And so I was getting paid by him.
Yeah.
And so he was very much in control of my schedule. Not that he used it in a controlling way, but if you were to remove yourself a little bit from like what it was.
There's a power dynamic.
There's a power
whether
dynamic.
Somebody's using it for evil or for good. You just like
Yes.
if you're teaching somebody and they fall in love with you, you have to realize that there's the hot for teacher, and it's just a psychological thing. There's just a power dynamic period that exists.
Yes. And there was a power dynamic there. And also, I had no idea what our finances were. It was something that he didn't want to disclose. I never had any idea. And so when there were times where we couldn't do something or something came up or that he was stressed about it, he would never be able to talk about it, similar to Michael. And it wouldn't create an argument. And it was something I didn't fully understand, like what that was in our dynamic together, but it was our inability to be able to talk about anything that was like a level below like surface emotion. So we couldn't.
So a bunch of avoidance get married, and the result is avoidance and divorce.
Yes, pretty much. Exactly. And towards the end of it, I went through a lot of emotions within the marriage, but I didn't know how to speak up for myself. And I didn't really realize that these things weren't normal until I started actually talking to other people about their relationships and then realizing like, wow, I didn't really have much of a say in my relationship. And then when I did start asking questions, it wasn't something we could ever talk about. And so I went from having resentment and not really anger, but resentment and fear and shame and all these things to just finally towards the end of it, just a complete like lack of apathy. Like by the end of it, there wasn't really anything that he could do or say that I really had any emotion towards whatsoever. And I kind of knew at that time that that's when it was over because I had no feeling of love, no feeling of hate, no feeling of shame, disappointment. Like I literally felt, I remember telling my therapist, I'm like, you know what? I'm actually good now. Like I'm through all these things. I actually it doesn't really bother me.
I don't feel anything. This is great.
I feel nothing. Yeah, I was like, it's so wonderful. I actually, I feel nothing.
I'm just not alive, so life can't bother me.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I would love to hear, just because I feel like we've both, like, at least for me, it's emotional. Where are you now?
Well, yeah, without going back into the navigating through the whole divorce piece of it, let me touch on that first. Navigating through the whole divorce piece of it was probably the logistical part, and the strategy behind it was actually pretty easy. Mm-hmm. He had been through a terrible divorce before. I wanted a few things. One, I didn't want him to experience that again. I really didn't. My parents had a terrible, terrible divorce. It was awful for them both. Mm-hmm. It was awful for us kids. And I didn't want my daughter to have to experience that. Like it was very important. Yeah. I wanted it to be the end goal, like I saw in my mind, was us being able to have a great co-parenting relationship, us to be friends, me to hopefully have a relationship someday with my stepkids. And so I didn't want to have anything be this like crazy dramatic thing. I kept it a secret from almost everyone except for you and like my business partner and my dad. Nobody knew about this. I didn't want to have any other opinions. I wanted it to just try to be as smooth sailing as it could possibly be. And it was not easy. It required a lot of patience on my end, a lot of zipping it, not saying what I actually did feel when we would have conversations, or he would get angry or he would get upset, because going through a divorce is up and down. Sometimes they're so kind to you, and then other times you get on the phone and they're like literally breaking something. Yeah. I mean, it's so volatile. And so there were so many times where I just had to hang up the phone and say, we're going to talk when we're both in a calm place. There was so much patience required to be able to get to where I am now, which is incredible. From a co-parenting team dynamic, we are great. We are great friends. We are cheerleaders for each other. Our daughter benefits the most. I don't even know if she even has any sort of negativity in her mind when it comes to us not being together, because we parent so well together. We're always there for her things. We can sit next to each other. If someone's in a relationship, they can bring that person, and it's incredible. And from a parenting dynamic and where I am right now from mental health and wellness, like I couldn't be in a better place. And I think a lot of it is because of how it was navigated, because there isn't now, like looking back on it, it wasn't this like tumultuous, like overly dramatic thing, even though it was so, so hard.
Yeah.
We don't have, when you look back on it, you can go, wow, that was really hard. But we had people that were supportive. We were still supportive of each other, even though some of these things were not easy. And so now you can look back on that and go, that was a hard time in both of our lives and a huge hurdle we had to overcome. And thankfully for that, we are where we are now because of the pain that that caused. You were able to literally look at and analyze, like, what are these things that I need to work on with myself to be in a better place, like physically, mentally, emotionally. And so now the answer to that question is now in a great place.
Yeah. Well, so there's a phrase, some of my other work is more spiritual, community based. And the phrase I hate is that my ex-husband is my greatest teacher, because I'm like, oh, I did not sign up for this class, but I did. The other phrase that really comes to mind is the blessing of that relationship is this idea that I learned all the places where I was not free. And by that, I mean all of the unconscious patterns, all of the self-sabotage. I mean, maybe not all, but like a lot of my patterns that I wasn't even aware of, a lot of my ideas about the world that were limiting myself and my understanding of my place in the world. A lot of ideas about how much I thought about how other people should be. Rather, like, I really thought for a long time that a boundary was me telling you how you need to behave. We'll get into that later. Needless to say, I was mad for a lot of the time. But and in that relationship, and by accepting, I don't want to say responsibility, because yes, we both have responsibility. He has responsibility. I have responsibility. But by accepting responsibility for what I can, I personally have an incredible life and a ton of freedom. And through that, I've been able to create a dynamic with my ex where I'm empowered and I tolerate or do not tolerate or come to agreements without self-abandoning. And then if I'm not self-abandoning, I don't hate him. So it's a wonderful place to be with myself, regardless of where he's at. And he happens to be in a great place too. And it's just incredible.
Claire, you always just wrap everything up like at the end and just like this like pretty like little bow.
Oh. Yeah, I thought you were the gift wrapper. We each have our own type of skills.
We each have our own type of skills.
Yeah.
Yes, we do. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Just
can I do a little sneak peek of the next episode?
Yeah, do it.
So the thing that I'm really excited about is that we've talked about, that little girl we were when we got married. We talked about the emotional experience of what it was like to actually initiate divorce. We have talked about where we are now. And what we haven't talked about is how we got here. And so that is coming up. And I am so excited to discuss that, because that was the missing piece for me. I would see these people who looked happy and I would just be like, How did you do it? How did you figure it out? So that's all I want to say is I'm really excited. I hope people tune in for the second episode,
which we're going to tell you all about
the how
on the next episode.
And a couple other things.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in. That's right. You're a Girl and How to Navigate Through Divorce, I guess.